Hi guys, my name is Devin Tabor, and I'm going to be presenting week two's topics of Social Perception 1. So this week we had some assigned reading from both of our textbooks as well as a couple of journals. To begin, we read in Casson chapter 3, The Social Self, and here we learned about the self-concept, which is how individuals think of themselves and who they believe that they are. We then read about self-esteem, which is how an individual feels about themselves and their basic human need for self-worth. And finally, concluding this chapter, we learned about self-presentation, which is how an individual wants to present themselves to others, how they want to shed a positive light on themselves so that others can see them the way that they want to be presented. Then we read chapter 4, titled Perceiving Persons, where we were introduced to the idea of social perception, how individuals come to understand each other and, make assumptions of who they are and why they are that way based off of attributions of behavior and cultures. We then take this information and we try to use it to confirm what we already know about that person or what we think we already know about that person, and that's referred to as confirmation bias. So I'm going to keep that pretty vague simply because I'm going to focus on all of those topics throughout my presentation. So I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So I'm going to switch gears and move on to Chat A. So Chat A, we read chapter 3, Attribution Theories, How People Make Sense of Behavior. We were introduced to 3 researchers, Hyder, Kelly, and Jones and Davis, as well as the folk conceptual theory. Now to summarize what we learned in this chapter, we first read about Hyder's theory of attribution and how it provided deep insights into the social perception of human action that assured attribution phenomena as a central position in social psychology. This chapter explains the fundamental assumption that humans spontaneously explain behavioral and social events and how it's led to many insights in the domains of social influence, self-regulation, relationships, and health. However, the chapter also wants us to acknowledge that traditional formations of attribution theory either focus too narrowly on influences of stable traits, such as the research done by Jones and Davis, or oversimplified the complex nature of behavior explanation, such as the research done by Kelly. Once we identify the conceptual framework within which people actually perceive, interpret, and evaluate behavior, a folk conceptual theory of behavior explanations emerged that describes and predicts various explanatory phenomena that had previously been overlooked or misrepresented. So moving on to chapter 5, which was social comparison, motives, standards, and mechanisms, we're introduced to Festinger. And Festinger hypothesized that communication primarily serves to reach agreement in the group, and that this pressure towards uniformity of opinions is based on 2 reasons. First is the need for group locomotion that makes it necessary that all of the group members hold similar opinions. The second, that there exists a need to agree on social reality because this would validate the accuracy of one's individual opinions and preferences. Now, for the why, who, and how of social comparisons. Why do people make social comparisons? Because people have a basic need to maintain a stable and accurate self-view. Who and how? Predominantly we make our social comparisons to those people that we're close with. We can most immediately relate to them or compare to them. But people tend to make downward comparisons, upward comparisons, and lateral comparisons to others, which I'll explain that in more detail later on. But these types of social comparisons will influence our self-evaluations as well. So after our textbook reading, we had 2 articles to read that focused on all of these topics. The first one was by Laczynnak. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably butchering it, but this article was titled Consumers' Responses to Negative Word-of-Mouth Communication as an Attribution Theory. And This individual hypothesized that consumers will generate predictable patterns of attributional responses to negative word-of-mouth communication messages that are systematically varied in terms of information content. Attributional responses will mediate the negative word-of-mouth communication brand evaluation. And finally, he hypothesized that consumer responses to negative word-of-mouth communication are likely to be influenced by strength of the targeted brand's name. So his results supported the hypothesis, but also showed that when receivers attribute the negativity of the word-of-mouth message to the brand brand evaluations then decrease. However, if the receivers attribute the negativity to the communicator, the brand evaluations increased. The next article we read was by Valkenburg, and it was Friend Networking Sites and Their Relationship to Adolescents' Well-Being and Social Self-Esteem. So Valkenburg hypothesized that these social media sites would increase the chance of adolescents forming relationships and receiving reactions on their profile. Now, she also hypothesized that these reactions would have a positive or negative effect on self-esteem and well-being. Now, the results of this study also supported the hypothesis, but Valkenburg also found that a majority of these experiences were positive, but there was also a percentage of adolescents who had some negative experiences as well. And these negative experiences did in fact have damaging impacts on their self-esteem and well-being. So essentially these kids were receiving positive and negative feedback, and that positive and negative feedback was showing in their study that it was helping boost their self-esteem, or it was deteriorating their sense of self-worth and well-being. So now that we've sort of summarized all of our readings, I want to dig a little bit deeper onto our main topics, or at least the topics that I found the most important. And that is self-concept, self-esteem, social perception, attribution theory, and social comparison. Now, the way I view these different topics is that not a single one of them can just stand alone on its own. They all are sort of intertangled together. So this is because the way individuals think of themselves is such a complex task in which we are often oblivious to the process in which this self-concept is created while we're in the middle of it. But our self-concept is what we have come to believe about ourselves. The way we think of ourselves will ultimately impact our self-esteem and our sense of self-worth. However, we come to these conclusions of self by evaluating how we perceive others and the attributions that encompass another person's sense of self. After we've evaluated perceptions of others, we then take that information and make social comparisons which circle all the way back to the self-concept and self-esteem. So first is the self-concept. The self is a frame of reference that powerfully influences our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Thus, self-concept is the sum total of an individual's belief about his or her own personal attributes. This self-concept is derived from the process of introspection, which is how people think of themselves, observe themselves, compare themselves, and how they assimilate with the culture around them. We often come to know ourselves by imagining what significant others think of us, and then incorporating these perceptions into our own self-concepts. Now, if an individual's self-concept has positive or negative evaluations, it will then have an effect on an individual's self-esteem. Self-esteem, the word esteem comes from the Latin word, I believe it's pronounced estimare, and it means to estimate or appraise. Therefore, the term self-esteem refers to our positive and negative evaluations of ourselves. Self-esteem is a reflection of an individual's need for self-worth, wanting to see ourselves in a positive light. Some individuals have higher self-esteem than others do, which is which is an attribute that can have a profound effect on the way they think about, feel about, and present themselves. It's important to keep in mind that although some of us have higher self-esteem than others, a feeling of self-worth is not etched in stone. Rather, it is a state of mind that fluctuates up and down in response to success, failure, social relations, and other life experiences. Now, that brings us back to Valkenburg's study on how social interactions from friend networking sites can have such a big impact on our self-esteem and well-being. These kids were having positive and negative feedback, thus damaging their self-esteem if it were negative, and boosting their self-esteem if it were to be positive. Now, moving on to social perception. Social perception is the process by which people come to understand one another. We first form impressions of others by their physical appearances, height, weight, skin color, hair, tattoos, piercings, glasses, and so on. We then take our preconceptions of what those physical appearances mean to us and evaluate what that means in regards to an individual's personality traits. For example, in our Casson textbook, we read about researchers Hassan and Trope and how they found that people prejudge others in photographs as kind-hearted rather than mean-spirited based on such features as a full round face, curly hair, long eyelashes, large eyes, a short nose, full lips, and an upturned mouth. Our first impressions aren't just influenced by a person's physical appearances and preconceptions, but observation of behavior, social settings, and nonverbal behavior, such as facial expressions, body language, vocal cues. Once we have formed an impression of someone, we then seek information that is likely to confirm what we think we already know. This is known as confirmation bias. Though we often make quick impressions of people intuitively, sometimes we are much more analytical in our attempts to make person or situational attributions to make sense of an individual's actions or behavior, which leads us to the attribution theory. Now, the term attribution has two essential parts. The first refers to explanations of behavior, and the second refers to inferring traits about an individual. Thus, people try to understand each other by attributing the causes of their behavior to personal or situational factors. Now, there's also two different types or concepts of cause. There's impersonal causality, meaning unintentional human behavior such as sneezing or feeling sad, and physical events such as waves, splashing, or leaves falling. Then there's personal causality, meaning intentional actions such as cleaning the kitchen or inviting someone to dinner. Intentionality is a concept that includes 5 requirements for an action to be judged as intentional. The action must be based on desire for a particular outcome, beliefs about those actions in relation with its outcome, a resulting intention to perform the action, and skill and awareness when actually performing it. Once all of the multiple factors of cause, behavior, situation, intentionality, and so on form what one may believe to be an attribution of another individual, we then begin to evaluate the way we perceive this individual, thus leading us to social comparisons. Now, social comparison refers to when an individual begins to evaluate their own qualities and traits by comparing themselves to others. These comparisons can influence people's judgments, experiences, and behaviors. Individuals tend to make 3 different types of comparisons. The first is a lateral comparison, which serves as a self-evaluation, seeking similarities between ourselves and others. Then there's downward comparisons, which serves as self-enhancement, because even our own failures can seem as a success when compared to someone who is less skilled than ourselves. And then we also have upward comparisons, which serve as a basis of self-improvement. This motivates people and provides information on how we can progress. So this idea of social comparison will influence how people think about themselves thus having an effect on the self-concept and how people feel about themselves, which is an effect on their self-esteem. So, in conclusion, all of these factors tie in together. The way individuals form their concepts of self is largely due to how they evaluate and compare themselves to others. We form perceptions of others based on different attributions that we then make self-comparisons that can either create positive or negative impacts on our self-esteem and self-worth, all of which can influence the way we think and feel, in addition to what we believe about ourselves. So with all of that information, I have 2 questions for you. My first question is in regard to self-concept. Do we begin to believe what information we have collected from the world about ourselves, or do we become what God already says that we are? For example, if an individual has come to believe their entire life that they will fail at something, will they become failures because they've decided to perceive themselves that way? Or will they find identity in Christ and become what God has intended them to be? Now, for this question, I want you to look to Ephesians chapter 1, verses 11 through 14. And then my second question is in relation to social perception. Social perception is without a doubt an idea I'm sure we can all relate to. Inherently, we come to conclusions about who people are and how we perceive their behaviors, appearances, preconceptions, and other nonverbal communications. However, with what we understand about social perception, how can we as people of faith avoid letting these worldly point of views cloud our judgments of how we perceive others? For this question, I want you to look to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 through 17. So think about your responses to these questions and comment below with any thoughts you may have had in addition to what I discussed here in the video about this week's topics, how you would go about answering those questions, and just tell me what you think. It was my pleasure to be able to present this week to you guys. I hope you all are having a fantastic week, and let me know what you all think.